Hello, this is James Cook, Assistant Professor of Social Science at the University of Maine at Augusta, and we're making up for a snow day with an Introduction to Sociology lecture on social capital. We've been talking about Robert Putnam and his book, Bowling Alone. We're having 3 classes to talk about social capital. In the first class, we talked about groups broadly, and then started thinking about an introduction to the idea of social capital, how it compares to human capital or economic capital. This is the second class in which we're talking about what the empirical trends are in social capital and civic engagement, a related idea, that are discussed by Robert Putnam and also extended in some GSS data. Excuse me. And then the third thing we're going to do in the third class is to talk about why. We're going to explain those trends. In doing so, I'd like to adopt Putnam's distinction between machers and schmoozers. He uses Yiddish, which is related to German, which is this idea about making, doing. In Chapter 6, we talked about instrumental activity, task-related activity versus schmoozers, talkers, emotional, expressively involved, people who are maintaining non-instrumental connections with one another. They're hanging out at bars, they're writing greeting cards to one another on their birthdays, they're inviting people over for dinner. Both are forms of activities, affiliations that build ties. Both create social capital. Both are important, and Robert Putnam, in the reading that you had for this week, tracked both. So, one of his strategies in this big book that you read is to go over and over and over again and say, you know, let's try to build a case that there's been a decline in social capital. First, let's talk about it through the machers, through civic engagement. Activities that are meant to do something to change the world for the better. Not just schmoozing, not just hanging out, not just getting to know people as friends, but accomplishing a task to make the world better. So he creates chart after chart after chart after chart to say, look, here's one kind of civic engagement, here's another kind of civic engagement, here's a third kind of civic engagement, and to try to show you that the general trend holds. However, if we look at some updated information, we might see a bit of a change. So a social science data network, data on voter turnout, for instance, finds that if you look at the year 1996, which was the last presidential election that Robert Putnam had experienced before he wrote this book and published it in the year 2000, before the 2000 election, you would see this declining trend for voting. But what's happened since then? Oh dear, it went up a little bit in 2000, it went up a little bit in 2004, up again in 2008, and this is among middle-aged people, who are the people that Robert Putnam says are the ones being lost, the middle years, right? And it was up again for that group in 2012. So it looks like there's some recovery there. Still, it's not as high as it was in 64, 68. Those were very high turnout years. Robert Putnam goes through, and in his figure 3 from this book, he talks about participation in campaign activities. It used to be, especially around 1970, 72 then, when there was a big presidential election year, 76, another big presidential election year, 1980, that people would attend political meetings, work for political parties, and then, boom, what happened? It started to drop off. His account for why that is that they're also not just not working for political parties, they're not attending speeches, they're not going to these activities on their own. It's replaced by paid staffers, paper organizations that consist of just a few people in an office who collect money from a lot of people but don't require their participation. Now, they may be very effective in getting policies changed or getting presidential candidates elected, but they don't involve people in a cause bigger than themselves in which they get to know one another. And they form social ties that creates this feeling of trust when you know the people in a community, whether that's a geographic community or, in this case, a political community. So if there are more paid staff that are replacing civic volunteers, he shows in Figure 7 something that looks good, which is the national number of nonprofit organizations per million people in the United States. It looks like it's going up, but these are paper organizations. They have no chapters, no meetings. They only want your money. Groups like the AARP, you don't show up for the American Association of Retired People to go to a meeting. And there are lots of other groups that are like that. Political action committees are like that. National Organization for Women is like that. You don't tend to show up for meetings. You just give them your donation and you move on. So he says the fact that these nonprofit organizations are increasing, these paper ones that have paid staff and just work off a large budget, is an indication that they're coming in to take on the role that used to be held by volunteer organizations. Our social capital is eroding, and so people with money are coming in and organizing on their own to fill up that space. The actual mean number of club meetings per year by people is declining, and that's a fairly convincing decline right there. Even informal activities, like writing a letter to your representative or your senator, signing a petition, it's not happening as much as it used to. This is Figure 6. He shows overall that if you take a look at 32 national chapter-based associations from 1900 to 1997, that the mean membership rate in those organizations declines. This is a big figure. It's Figure 8. It's in... we'll find it. It's on page 54. But I want you to be a little skeptical about this one. I want you to think about what that means. What are some of the groups that are talked about here, right? Groups like the Grange, groups like Odd Fellows. There's an Odd Fellows Hall in Maine that you can find. There's more than one, but can you find any actual Odd Fellows organizations? You might find a few that are left, but they tend to involve very old people because it's a very old organization. There's something that tends to happen to organizations. In 1900, they get founded. Now, the ones that Putnam studies are not the ones that get founded and then die. They're the ones that get founded and then persist and grow. The ones that died after 5 or 10 years, Putnam doesn't study. So that means that, of course, we're going to see an increase because those are the ones that Putnam is interested in. But what happens after a while to organizations, right? These 32 chapter-based organizations that are described in the chapter on civic participation, they tend to get old. They tend to ossify. They tend to shrink. They tend to fall away. Why? Because they're being replaced by new groups. There's liability of newness for an organization, that is, that new groups that form are likely to drop off, but there's also a liability of oldness, which is that old organizations tend to kind of fade away after a while. He's not studying different chapter-based associations, the popular ones in every decade. He's studying the ones that were popular back before the invention of the car or the television, back before people used electricity to a wide extent in their homes. That's a long time ago, with a different set of organizations. Temperance organizations are in there. So should we be surprised that these declined? Perhaps not. However, we can look at other kinds of declines. Now, this is an update on some of the data that he described, how often a respondent to the General Social Survey, the GSS, attends religious services. The red bars on the bottom indicate the percent who say never. That's gone up. The percent who say every week, it used to be thicker, now it's thinner. In general, the percent that rarely or never attend has increased. Now, if you're not a religious person, you may not agree with the substance of religion, but despite the substance of religions, one of the things that a religious body does is it brings people together every week or maybe every month, and they get to know each other, they get to form social ties, they form that social glue. In a community, like a political community, this is a religious community in which trust can occur and people work together. Putnam does show that that declines. We can also see a strong decline in union membership. From 1900 to 1998, it's not as low as it was in 1900, keep in mind, right? But it has declined since the glorious 50s that Robert Putnam talks about. And if we extend that by looking at Bureau of Labor Statistics data, which is where Robert Putnam gets this information, the percent of employed people who are union members has further gone down. Okay, so we can actually append that data onto the end here from 2005 to 2010, and you can see the decline that was happening. The red line is the United States, the blue line is Maine, just to show you that Maine is tracking the United States in general. The decline has continued. You might like unions. You might not like unions. That's not the point. The point is that whatever it is that unions do, something that you like, something you don't like, they do bring people together. They bring people together in meetings, they have them coordinate activity, they form social ties, they create that social glue that keeps people together and increases generalized reciprocity and trust and makes it easier for a society to go ahead and do the things it wants to do, whether they're union related or not. So that's fairly convincing. And so even if you have problems with one of the charts, and that chart on the 32, excuse me, national chapter-based organizations, I do have a bit of a problem with, and other people do too. Robert Putnam does a pretty good job of saying, hang on, I have something else to show you, and to talk about the general trend. What about schmoozing? We talked about maching, the makers, the doers, the people who are striving for something you might agree with, something you might not. But then there's schmoozing. Schmoozers are these informal socializers. They're the people who hang out. They throw parties. They send cards to friends. They spend a night in the bar. You might like bars. Some of you do. Some of you don't. Some of you wrote in your response to the surveys that you never would go to a bar, and you would underline it. Never, I would never. There's a moral element to that. But regardless of what you think of the moral element, one of the things that happens in a bar is that people socialize with each other. They schmooze. They form ties. Those ties can mean something later. Schmoozing acts like social glue too. And here we have one indication in figure 23 from the General Social Survey, by the way, of the percent who spend a social evening with someone who lives in your neighborhood. This is the percent about once a month or more from 1974 to 1998. Looks like a pretty big decline, doesn't it? Well, a fairly big decline. So it's a decline in neighboring. Well, okay. So if we spend less time with our neighbors, does that mean that we have a weaker social glue? That's Putnam's argument. But I want to update this data, and I also want to point out that in the General Social Survey, this is only one question among a set of schmoozing-related questions. There's a question about bars. There's a question about friendships outside the neighborhood. Why hasn't Putnam included those in his graph? Well, in part because he included the one that up to the year, 1998 or so. Was it 1998? Yeah, it was 1998, okay, in the General Social Survey. The one that looked like it had declined the most, okay. I can't tell you about his motivation there, but if you actually look at the percent who say they spend at least one night a month with people in a bar, which is the lowest level, by the way, of all those other groups, schmoozing activities, it seems kind of steady, or maybe even going up a little bit. Not so much change over the last generation, is it? What about spending time with friends outside the neighborhood? Oh, that's kind of gone up a little, hasn't it? Okay. Oh, what about a bit about spending the night with relatives? That was the most common in your responses to the survey, which we'll talk about next week in class. But, that's gone up, especially over the last decade. But it had remained essentially the same even at the period when Robert Putnam was writing his book. So, is social capital maybe not so much on the decline as we thought? At least related to schmoozing, it seems like possibly the answer is yes. Or what about Maine in particular? One of the things that's really cool is that Robert Putnam has taken the data from Bowling Alone, and he's made some of it available at bowlingalone.org/data.htm. That's a website. You can see it down here at the bottom. Pause the video, write it down. You can go check out some of this data yourself. I've gotten some data. The GSS data comes from another place. The General Social Survey is a nationally representative survey that's carried out every few years, and it has been since 1974. Really cool. And that data is also publicly available. Come see me in office hours if you'd like to play with it. But a nice thing that they've done at bowlingalone.org, the website to support this book, is that they've created a 50-state social capital index. Actually, there are a few states that are left out. Hawaii seems to be left out of the mix. Maybe they had some difficulty collecting statistics. But what they do is they combine 14 indicators. Some of them are survey responses, like I spend a lot of time visiting friends, I feel most people can be trusted, most people are honest. They also take a look at the number of civic and social organizations per 1,000 population in the state, the number of group memberships, the average number of times volunteered in the last year, the turnout in presidential elections, all indications of some kind of schmoozing or some kind of mocking. The number of nonprofit organizations per 1,000 population, which is a little bit curious that they're including that in there, because Putnam was, just a few pages ago, he was discounting them as paper organizations. But okay, it's just one of 14 indicators, and overall you can try to rank these states. Now think about which states you think would be high in social capital, which states would be low. Where do you think Maine fits? Pause the video for a second, think about it. You think it's going to be high in social capital or low in social capital? Let's find out. The index, by the way, goes, I believe, from -2 to +2. There's some negative numbers. That means low social capital, low responses on these 14 indicators. There can be high responses as well, indicating that people tend to report high amounts of social capital. And there's Maine in blue. It has a positive number. It's not as positive as some others, like Iowa, Minnesota, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Vermont, one of our near neighbors. But it is fairly high. If you take a look, it just surpasses 0.5. How many other states do that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. It's one of the top 13. So in fact, it kind of is number 13 in the list. And there are a lot of states that are lower. Maine does pretty well. There are a lot of states that do really poorly. Mississippi, Nevada, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama. If you think about some of those states, and no offense to people living in those states, but collectively speaking, they have a poor outcome. If you think about Alabama and you think about Mississippi, there are higher infant mortality rates, life expectancy is lower, social capital is lower as well. That's a little bit curious. You might start to want to think about that question now. Why is it that social capital is low? Because once you start to ask the question about in different places, in different states or different cities, towns, communities, why social capital can be high, why it can be low, you can think about why that happens, and you can think about what the outcome would be. Okay. I know we had a snow day. This is a short video. but I hope this kind of brings together some of the themes in Robert Putnam's work in the middle section where he's tracking trends. And I encourage you to keep reading for next week. We will move ahead and have that quiz. And speaking of quizzes, for quiz number 6, I sent out an email to you. If you have not received that email yet, because it had an attachment, it had the quiz on it, please let me know. Give me a call. 621-3190 is my office phone number, and I always check it. If I'm not in the office where I can talk to you, I will send you a message right back. I will make sure that we can get that quiz to you. But you need to get in touch with me, preferably within the next day or two, so we can have you complete that quiz at home. Make sure that when you do that, it's closed book, no notes. I want you to treat it like it's just in the classroom, just as if it's in the classroom, but otherwise, I'm sure you'll do reasonably well if you spend your time studying the book. Have a good day, and I'll see you next week.